In the deepest archaeological layers beneath the ruins of Eridu, where the oldest bricks in Mesopotamia rest against virgin soil, there is a problem that no one has satisfactorily explained. The city appears complete from the first level. There is no awkward beginning, no trial and error phase in the architecture. The irrigation channels are carved with geometric precision into bedrock. The temple foundations are aligned to celestial coordinates that require centuries of observation to calculate. And the urban planning reflects a sophistication that should not exist in humanity's first experiment with civilization. The Sumerians themselves did not claim to have invented these systems. They said they were taught. The cuneiform tablets recovered from Eridu's lowest strata describe beings called Apkallu, a word that translates roughly as great sages or those who know. These were not gods in the abstract sense. They were instructors, watchers. The texts say they descended when the earth was young, before the cities, before the flood, and they opened the eyes of the black-headed people. That was the Sumerian term for themselves, people whose eyes had been closed. Perhaps you are listening to this now in a quiet room, or in the dark hours before sleep, when the day has ended and the mind is still turning. You're not alone in wondering what was left out of the history we were taught. Others have asked these questions before, in older languages, and left their answers buried in clay. If you are finding value in this, consider subscribing. We will not ask again. The Uruk tablets expand the story. One fragment, catalogued as W2037 in a German museum collection, names 7 primary Apkallu, 7 figures, each responsible for a specific domain of knowledge: irrigation, metallurgy, astronomy, temple construction. The text says they possess the Mi, a Sumerian word that has no direct translation but refers to the fundamental decrees that govern reality itself. Laws of nature, principles of order, technologies of transformation. The Mi were not discovered by humans, they were given. But there is something else in that tablet, a detail that does not fit comfortably into the narrative of primitive myth-making. The text says the Apkallu could see across the waters of time, that they perceived events that had not yet occurred. The phrasing is too specific to be poetic. It describes a capability. The Egyptian records contain parallel figures. The Neteru, beings who ruled during Zep-Tepi, the first time, a primordial epoch before the dynastic kings. The Turin Papyrus, a fragile document preserved from the reign of Ramses II, lists these rulers by name: Ptah, Ra, Shu, Gebenat, Osiris. Each reign is measured not in decades, but in thousands of years. 9,000 years for Ptah alone, according to the text. The papyrus does not present this as allegory, it presents it as record. Manetho, the Egyptian priest historian who compiled the king lists in the 3rd century BC, described these Neteru as possessing knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering that exceeded human capabilities. He wrote that they established the calendar, invented writing, and designed the architectural principles that would govern temple construction for 3 millennia. His account was preserved by later historians not as mythology, but as historical documentation of a period that preceded known civilization. The correspondence between the Mesopotamian Apkallu and the Egyptian Neteru is not superficial. Ptah's role as the master craftsman, the shaper of matter, mirrors Enki's position in Sumerian cosmology as the god of wisdom and genetic manipulation. Both are described as beings who taught humanity the practical arts. Both are associated with underground chambers, with water, with the shaping of clay into life. Ra's dominion over the sky corresponds to Anu's position as the supreme celestial authority in Mesopotamian tradition. Both are described as overseeing cosmic order from a distance. delegating earthly responsibilities to subordinate beings. Both are associated with astronomical knowledge, the ability to calculate eclipses, predict planetary movements, and encode celestial constants into architectural layouts. The architectural evidence is harder to dismiss than the texts. At Tel Es-Sawan in central Iraq, archaeologists uncovered a settlement dating to 6000 BC. The site contains irrigation canals designed according to precise mathematical principles. The pottery is decorated with astronomical motifs, patterns that, when analysed by archaeoastronomers, correspond to detailed observations of planetary cycles and lunar phases. This is not decorative art, it is data, knowledge encoded into clay by people who should not have possessed it. The same pattern appears at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, where megalithic pillars carved with intricate iconography date to 9500 BC. The stone cutting is clean. The alignments are exact. The engineering is sophisticated. There is no progression toward this capability. It simply exists, fully formed, in the archaeological record. In Egypt, the Giza pyramids encode mathematical relationships that were not formally recognized until the Greek period. Pi, phi, the dimensions of the Earth's hemisphere. These are not approximations. They are precise values, calculated to multiple decimal places and embedded into stone structures that weigh millions of tons. The conventional explanation is independent invention, parallel development, coincidence. But the deeper the analysis goes, the more uncomfortable that explanation becomes. The Sumerian king list, composed around 2100 BC but referencing much older sources, describes a period before the flood when kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. It names the 7 Apkallu, who served as advisors to these ancient monarchs. The first, Adapa, is described as he who completed the plans of heaven and earth. Mesopotamian literature says Adapa's wisdom was so comprehensive that he accidentally broke the south wind's wing, a metaphor perhaps, or perhaps a description of atmospheric manipulation technology, and was summoned before Anu, the sky god, for judgment. The second sage, Uan, appears in multiple sources as the founder of the priesthood and the inventor of writing. Berosus, the Babylonian historian writing in the 3rd century BC, describes Uan as an amphibious being who emerged from the Persian Gulf to teach humanity the foundations of civilization. The description is specific, fish-like in appearance, but capable of assuming human form. His teachings included mathematics, astronomy, and the proper construction of temples. This is not the language of allegory, it is the language of documentation. The linguistic trail deepens the mystery. The Sumerian word igigi originally referred to divine beings, but in the earliest texts it specifically denotes entities who maintained constant surveillance over human activities. The Akkadian term IgE carries connotations of beings who see from above, and appears in contexts suggesting the ability to observe multiple locations simultaneously. This terminology did not disappear, it evolved. The Hebrew word ar, meaning watcher, appears in the book of Daniel and derives from an Aramaic root that traces back to the Akkadian igi. The linguistic continuity spans thousands of years and multiple cultures. It suggests that the concept of divine watchers was not mythological, but represented a consistent tradition, one that crossed borders, survived catastrophes, and was carefully preserved. Archaeological evidence from Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt shows pre-dynastic tomb paintings depicting tall figures with distinctive headgear, carrying objects that resemble sophisticated instruments rather than ceremonial items. The artistic style shows Mesopotamian influence. The chronology places these images before the unification of Egypt. during a period when contact between the Nile and Tigris-Euphrates valleys should have been minimal, yet the iconography is nearly identical. The precision of early bronze artefacts from both regions reveals another anomaly. Metallurgical analysis shows alloy compositions and manufacturing techniques that typically require centuries of gradual experimentation, but these techniques appear simultaneously in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley during the early 3rd millennium BC, fully developed, with no evident learning curve. The astronomical knowledge is even more difficult to explain. The Mayan calendar, the Egyptian civil calendar, and the Mesopotamian astronomical tablets all demonstrate understanding of celestial mechanics that required sophisticated mathematical calculations and long-term observational data. The consistency of these systems across cultures separated by oceans and millennia suggests derivation from common preserved sources rather than independent discovery. The Plimpton 322 tablet, a Babylonian mathematical text dating to approximately 1800 BC, contains trigonometric calculations that were not supposed to be rediscovered until the Greek period. The sophistication of the mathematics indicates transmission of knowledge from earlier sources that possessed capabilities far beyond what the chronology allows. There is a pattern here, a discontinuity, knowledge that appears too early, too complete, too coordinated across distant regions. The ancient texts offer an explanation. They say the knowledge was not discovered, it was inherited, transmitted, taught by beings who watched from the heights of heaven and decided that humanity was ready, or perhaps that humanity was needed. But that explanation creates another problem. If the watchers taught humanity, where did they come from? And more quietly, more uncomfortably, where did they go? The question of origin appears in fragments scattered across tablets that were never meant to be read together. The Babylonian creation epic, Enuma Elish, describes beings called Anunnaki, who existed before the current cosmic order was established. They are portrayed not as creators of the universe, but as administrators of it, entities who fix the fates and establish the ordinances of heaven and earth. The text is careful about sequence. The Anunnaki did not create the world, they organized it. The distinction matters. It suggests a hierarchy that extends beyond what the Mesopotamian scribes could observe. The Anunnaki themselves answered to higher authorities, received instructions, operated within constraints. They were not omnipotent. They were assigned. The administrative tablets from Nippur, the religious centre of ancient Sumer, contain personnel records, lists of names, titles and responsibilities that read more like bureaucratic documentation than mythology. The texts describe exactly 200 Igigi, lesser divine beings who served under the primary Anunnaki, is leadership. They perform physical labour, mining operations, construction projects, agricultural development. The work was difficult enough that, according to the Atrahasis epic, they eventually rebelled. That rebellion becomes important later. It is the reason given for human creation. The three primary figures who dominated the Anunnaki Council, Anu, Enlil, and Enki, established territorial divisions that divided the known world into administrative zones. The cuneiform texts describe this arrangement with the precision of land surveys. Anu's domain encompassed the northern regions, particularly the areas around modern Turkey and the Caucasus Mountains. Enlil controlled the atmospheric realm and the central Mesopotamian plains. Enki governed the subterranean regions and the southern marshlands near the Persian Gulf. These were not symbolic territories. The boundary stones, known as Kuduru, dating from the Kassite period, but preserving earlier traditions, provide explicit geographical coordinates. They specify which mountain peaks remained forbidden to human settlement due to their continued occupation by celestial beings. They mark the borders between zones with the same legal precision used for property rights and water access. The ziggurat complexes built throughout Mesopotamia were designed to facilitate communication between earthly priests and these territorial authorities. The structures contained acoustic chambers that amplified sound at specific frequencies. The purpose, according to the ritual texts, was to enable human voices to reach the divine administrators who no longer walked openly among the population. But something changed. The later texts describe it as a separation, a withdrawal. The Watchers, who had once lived in the cities, who had walked the streets and taught in the temples, gradually retreated to the mountain installations and the underground complexes. The direct instruction ended. Knowledge transmission became mediated through selected intermediaries, priests and kings who underwent specific preparation. The nature of that preparation is described in uncomfortable detail in the Atrahasis epic. The text says that when the Igigi rebelled against their labour conditions, Enki proposed creating a new type of being to perform the necessary work. Not another divine entity, but something hybrid, something that could think, plan and execute complex tasks, but that would remain fundamentally limited in capability and lifespan. The goddess Nintu, working under Enki's direction, is described as mixing the clay of the earth with the blood of a slain god to create the first humans. The text provides procedural details. 14 pieces of clay were prepared, 7 to become male and 7 to become female. Each piece was implanted with divine essence and gestated for a specified period before being brought to life. The language is too specific to be purely metaphorical. It describes materials, processes, time periods. It reads like a technical manual translated by scribes who did not fully understand what they were documenting. The Akkadian version identifies the slain god as Kingu, a being described as possessing intelligence and wisdom that would be transferred to the new creations. The epic indicates that his genetic material was carefully processed and refined before being incorporated into the clay matrix. The terminology suggests understanding of genetic isolation and purification techniques. Modern readers dismiss this as mythology, but the text itself does not present it as myth. It presents it as history, as the origin story of a workforce, not the spiritual allegory of humanity's place in the cosmos. The results of this creation process, according to the same texts, produced humans who possess capabilities that exceeded those of purely natural beings. The first created humans had lifespans of several hundred years, enhanced intelligence, and the ability to communicate directly with their creators. These capabilities gradually diminished over successive generations, requiring periodic intervention to maintain desired characteristics in certain bloodlines. The Sumerian king list corroborates this pattern. The earliest kings are recorded as ruling for thousands of years. Then the numbers drop, centuries, then decades, until the lifespans reach normal human ranges. The text does not explain this as divine punishment or symbolic ages. It records it as data. The genetic manipulation described in these sources was not a one-time event. The texts describe ongoing programs, selections, modifications, the creation of enhanced individuals who could serve as effective intermediaries between divine and human populations. These enhanced rulers, according to the king list, possessed not only extended lifespans, but abilities that surpassed normal human limitations. The tablets from Maori, excavated from a throne room by French archaeologist André Parot between 1933 and 1955, provide physical evidence of authority transfer ceremonies. The chamber contains a raised platform with metallic inlays arranged in geometric patterns. The platform shows signs of intense heat exposure, scorch marks that indicate energy discharge of considerable magnitude. The archaeological team found no conventional explanation for the heat damage, no fire pits, no burned offerings, no evidence of accident. But the ritual texts describe ceremonies in which authority was formally transferred from celestial beings to human representatives through objects called the Tablets of Destinies. These were not conventional clay tablets. The Epic of Anzu describes them as shining like stars and speaking with voices of thunder when activated. The text says they granted their possessor control over natural forces and the ability to issue binding decrees that affected both divine and human realms. The epic recounts what happened when the bird demon Anzu stole these tablets without understanding their proper use. Chaos, systems failed, order collapsed. The tablets apparently required specific knowledge to operate, perhaps specific genetic or technological preparation in the operator. The Hebrew tradition preserves a parallel account. The Book of Enoch, dating to approximately the 3rd century BC but drawing from earlier oral sources, describes 200 watchers who descended to Mount Hermon during the days of Jared. These beings made a binding oath to violate divine commandments by taking human wives and teaching forbidden knowledge to mankind. The specific number, 200 watchers, matches exactly the Mesopotamian administrative records describing 200 Igigi who served under the primary Anunnaki leadership before their rebellion. The correspondence is too precise to be coincidental. The Aramaic fragments discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran preserve detailed lists of the Watcher leaders and their specific domains of expertise. Shemyazer, described as chief of the Watchers, taught enchantments and root cutting, activities that correspond to Mesopotamian traditions of agricultural manipulation and pharmaceutical knowledge. Azazel, the second-ranking Watcher, instructed humanity in metallurgy and weapon-making, teaching men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. These are not abstract spiritual teachings. They are practical technologies. The same technologies attributed to the Mesopotamian Apkallu. The geographical setting matters. Mount Hermon, located on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, rises to 2,114 metres above sea level. It occupies a strategic position that controlled ancient trade routes between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean coast. Archaeological surveys conducted by the Israel Antiquities Authority have revealed extensive remains of ancient religious installations on the mountain. Massive stone circles, megalithic structures that predate known historical settlements in the region. The summit contains ruins of a temple complex with foundation stones weighing over 20 tons, fitted together with precision that requires advanced engineering capabilities. The orientation of these structures aligns with astronomical phenomena that were significant in Mesopotamian celestial observations. The coordination suggests that religious activities conducted at Mount Hermon were connected to the divine hierarchies described in cuneiform literature. The Enochic tradition emphasizes Mount Hermon as the descent point for the Watchers, corresponding to Mesopotamian accounts of sacred mountains, serving as interfaces between celestial and terrestrial domains. The Sumerian concept of the Hersag, literally mountain house, described specific elevated locations where divine beings maintain permanent installations for communication with cosmic superiors. But the most disturbing element of the Enochic account is not the descent, it is the punishment. The text describes how the Watchers were bound in the valleys of the earth and condemned to witness the destruction of their offspring before facing final judgment. Their children, beings called Nephilim, described as giants possessing both divine and human characteristics, were systematically eliminated through catastrophic intervention. The Mesopotamian sources describe the same event. They call it the Flood. The Flood narratives appear in every major ancient tradition from the Near East. But they do not describe a natural disaster. They describe a decision, a reset. The Atrahasis epic states explicitly that the flood was ordered by Enlil to eliminate a problem that had grown beyond acceptable parameters. The problem was not human wickedness in the abstract sense. It was genetic contamination, unauthorized hybridization. The texts describe a situation in which the boundaries between divine and human populations had been violated, producing offspring that possessed capabilities their creators had not intended to grant. The Nephilim were not merely large or strong. They were cognitively enhanced, technologically aware, and according to the Enochic sources, increasingly uncontrollable. Enlil's solution was categorical. The Mesopotamian texts describe how he convened the divine council and proposed using atmospheric manipulation technology to generate a global deluge that would eliminate the contaminated bloodlines while preserving selected genetic samples for post-catastrophe repopulation. But Enki objected. The texts are clear about this. There was disagreement among the Anunnaki leadership about the appropriate response. Enki argued for preservation of certain human lineages, particularly those who had not been compromised by unauthorized genetic mixing. He provided advance warning to Utnapishtim in the Mesopotamian account, to Noah in the Hebrew tradition, instructing them in the construction of survival vessels and the preservation of genetic material. The specifications for these vessels appear in multiple independent sources with remarkable consistency. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim's boat as a cube-shaped structure, 7 stories tall, divided into compartments with waterproof ceiling. The dimensions are precise, 120 cubits on each side, constructed using specific materials and techniques that would ensure stability in turbulent conditions. The Genesis account provides parallel details. Noah's Ark was 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, dimensions that naval engineers recognise as producing exceptional seaworthiness. The structure included 3 decks, a window system for ventilation, and compartmentalised storage. These are not the specifications of myth. They are the specifications of marine engineering. The purpose of these vessels was not merely human survival. Both traditions emphasise the preservation of animal species, breeding pairs, genetic samples, the biological diversity necessary for ecosystem reconstruction. The instructions suggest understanding of population genetics, minimum viable populations, and the genetic bottleneck problem that would result from catastrophic species reduction. The flood itself is described with atmospheric precision. The Mesopotamian texts say the waters came from both above and below. Atmospheric precipitation combined with the breaking open of subterranean aquifers. The description suggests coordinated manipulation of multiple hydrological systems, cloud seeding, pressure systems, tectonic destabilization of underground water reserves. The duration matters. Most traditions specify that the waters prevailed for 150 days before receding. That timeframe is too consistent across independent sources to be arbitrary. It suggests calculation, the minimum period necessary to ensure that surface contamination was eliminated, that structures were destroyed, that the archaeological record was effectively erased. Geological evidence supports the occurrence of catastrophic flooding events during the period when these civilizations were emerging. Marine sediment deposits have been found in Mesopotamian archaeological sites. layered between occupation levels. The Royal Cemetery at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, revealed an 8-foot layer of clean clay, separating earlier settlements from later ones, evidence of flooding on a scale that exceeded normal river overflow. Similar flood deposits appear in the archaeological record throughout the ancient Near East, all dating to approximately the same period. The synchronicity suggests a regional catastrophe of extraordinary magnitude, not a local weather event. But the texts indicate that certain installations survived: underground complexes, mountain facilities, locations where the Watchers had maintained permanent infrastructure. The Enochic tradition describes how certain Watchers were imprisoned in these underground chambers, bound and condemned to witness the consequences of their unauthorized interventions from sealed locations beneath the earth. The Mesopotamian Bit Meseri text describes similar punishment for divine beings who exceeded their authority. They were stripped of administrative positions and confined to specific geographical locations where they could no longer influence human development. The punishment involved forced observation. They were required to watch the destruction of their offspring and the collapse of the civilizations they had helped build. After the waters receded, the texts describe a careful reconstruction process. The Divine Council established new protocols. Direct contact between Watchers and human populations was prohibited. Knowledge transfer would occur only through authorized channels, mediated by selected priests and kings who underwent specific preparation and maintained strict protocols. The ziggurat complexes built throughout Mesopotamia during the post-flood period served as communication interfaces under these new restrictions. They were designed as artificial mountains that replicated the function of natural sacred peaks, places where properly prepared humans could receive instructions from divine authorities without direct physical contact. The acoustic chambers within these structures were engineered to amplify human voices at specific frequencies that apparently penetrated to receivers in underground or elevated locations. The ritual texts describe complex procedures for activating these communication systems, specific times of day, particular astronomical alignments, carefully controlled linguistic formulas. But something else changed after the flood. The texts describe it as a shortening, a limitation. The maximum human lifespan was deliberately reduced. Genesis states this explicitly. The Divine Council decreed that human days would be limited to 120 years. The earlier patriarchs had lived for centuries. After the flood, the numbers dropped steadily until they stabilized at normal human ranges. The Sumerian king list shows the same pattern. Pre-flood kings ruled for thousands of years. Post-flood kings ruled for centuries, then decades. The transition is documented as data, not as metaphor. Something was modified in the human population after the flood, a genetic adjustment that limited both lifespan and cognitive capability. The reason for this limitation appears in the Mesopotamian texts. The Anunnaki Council determined that humans with extended lifespans and enhanced cognitive abilities had posed a control problem. They accumulated too much knowledge, developed too much independence, began questioning their relationship with their creators. The genetic modification that reduced lifespan also reduced the knowledge accumulation problem. But certain bloodlines were exempted from this limitation. The royal lineages, the priestly families, these individuals continued to display lifespans and abilities that exceeded normal human ranges. They were the authorized intermediaries, the carefully maintained genetic lines through which the Watchers would continue to influence human civilization under the new restrictions. The tablets of destinies, the devices that granted authority over natural forces, were transferred to these selected bloodlines through formal ceremonies. The texts describe how human representatives were brought to sacred locations, underwent preparatory procedures, and physically handled the tablets to establish recognition protocols. The devices apparently required biometric identification. They would respond only to individuals who had been genetically prepared for this responsibility. The archaeological evidence from Maori's throne room, with its metallic inlays and heat-damaged platform, suggests that these authority transfer ceremonies involved energy discharge, perhaps the activation of biological markers, perhaps the imprinting of command authorization into nervous systems that had been engineered to receive it. The mathematical knowledge that appears in post-flood civilizations shows clear continuity with pre-flood sources. The Plimpton 322 tablet demonstrates trigonometric sophistication that required centuries of accumulated observation and calculation. But there is no evidence of that gradual accumulation in the archaeological record. The knowledge appears complete, as if it had been preserved through the catastrophe and transmitted to the rebuilding civilizations. The astronomical observations encoded in Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Indus Valley texts show the same pattern. They contain precise measurements of celestial phenomena that required long-term data collection, but the civilizations using this data were newly established. The observations must have predated the cultures that recorded them. This suggests deliberate preservation, archives that survived the flood, knowledge stores maintained in protected locations. The texts hint at this. They describe the Apkallu as preserving the plans of heaven and earth before the waters rose, securing the fundamental knowledge necessary for rebuilding civilization after the reset. The Egyptian tradition preserves the same concept. The god Thoth is credited with recording all knowledge on pillars that survived the flood. The Hermetic texts describe these pillars as containing the complete understanding of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering, everything necessary to reconstruct advanced civilization from surviving populations. But the question that emerges from these accounts is not whether knowledge was preserved. It is why the reset was necessary in the first place. The texts suggest that the pre-flood world had developed in directions that threatened the control systems the Watchers had established. The hybrid populations were becoming too capable, too independent. They were beginning to understand the technologies they had been taught, reverse engineering the systems, asking questions about their creators' origins and authority. The flood eliminated that threat. It destroyed the physical infrastructure, reduced the population to manageable levels, and imposed genetic limitations that would prevent the problem from recurring. The post-flood civilizations would develop under stricter supervision, with knowledge transmitted gradually, under controlled conditions, to populations whose cognitive capabilities had been deliberately constrained, but the memory survived, the traditions were preserved, and in those preserved traditions there is a detail that creates a quiet unease. The texts say, "The Watchers are still here." The continuity of the Watcher presence appears in the administrative records that govern the post-flood period. The texts do not describe a departure. They describe a reorganization, a shift in operational protocols. The Anunnaki, who had walked openly among human populations, withdrew to installations that are described with consistent geographical precision across multiple sources. The boundary stones specify mountain peaks that remained forbidden territories. These were not symbolic prohibitions. The Kuduru texts include legal penalties for humans who approached these locations without authorization. The penalties were severe enough to suggest that enforcement was reliable and that violations were detectable. Mount Hermon remained designated as an active Watcher installation throughout the historical period. The temple complex on its summit was continuously maintained, though the texts indicate that human priests performed their rituals at a distance from the innermost chambers. The archaeological remains show this spatial division. Outer courtyards accessible to humans, inner sanctums with entrance passages too narrow for the massive foundation stones to have been installed after construction. The underground complexes beneath major Mesopotamian cities show similar patterns. The chambers beneath the Enlil temple at Nippur extend far deeper than conventional religious architecture requires. The excavations by the University of Pennsylvania expedition between 1889 and 1900 revealed sophisticated ventilation systems that maintain constant air circulation despite being sealed for millennia. The engineering suggests permanent occupation, not occasional ritual use. The chamber walls display carved reliefs depicting mechanical devices that appear to be atmospheric monitoring equipment. The imagery is too specific to be decorative. It shows instrumentation, panels with measurement markings, conduits connecting different components, control interfaces operated by figures whose proportions match the descriptions of the Anunnaki rather than ordinary humans. Similar underground structures appear beneath Egyptian sites. The chambers discovered beneath the Giza Plateau by teams led by archaeologist Mark Lehner contain granite blocks fitted with tolerances measured in fractions of millimetres. The precision required for this construction suggests access to advanced cutting and shaping tools that have no equivalent in conventional ancient technology. But these underground installations were not merely storage facilities. The text described them as operational centres, locations where the Anunnaki continued to monitor human development and coordinate the activities of their authorised intermediaries on the surface. The communication protocols established after the flood created a hierarchical system. Human priests and kings did not interact directly with the primary Anunnaki authorities. They communicated with intermediary entities, beings the texts call igigi or messengers, who relayed instructions from the underground councils to surface populations. The ritual texts describe the timing and procedures for these communications with extraordinary specificity. Certain ceremonies could only be performed during particular astronomical alignments. The linguistic formulas had to be recited with exact pronunciation. The offerings required precise materials prepared according to detailed specifications. These were not religious observances, they were technical protocols, procedures designed to activate communication systems that required specific inputs to function. The ziggurat at Eridu, the oldest and most sacred of Mesopotamian religious structures, contains acoustic features that reveal its communication function. The internal chambers are designed to create resonance at specific frequencies. Modern acoustic analysis has shown that sounds produced in certain chambers are amplified and directed downward through stone channels that penetrate deep into the earth. The ziggurat at Babylon, described in cuneiform texts as Etemenanki, the foundation of heaven and earth, incorporated similar acoustic engineering. The structure rose in 7 stages, each level corresponding to one of the 7 primary Anunnaki authorities. The ritual texts indicate that priests ascended to different levels depending on which divine authority they needed to contact, suggesting that each level was tuned to communicate with specific underground or elevated receivers. The Hebrew tradition preserves a memory of this structure in the Tower of Babel narrative. The Genesis account describes humanity attempting to build a tower reaching to heaven, using brick and bitumen, precisely the materials described in Mesopotamian ziggurat construction. The divine response was to confuse human language, making coordination impossible. But the cuneiform sources suggest a different interpretation. The Babylonian texts describe Etemenanki not as humanity's rebellious attempt to reach heaven, but as a sanctioned communication facility built according to divine specifications. The confusion of languages may refer not to linguistic barriers, but to the introduction of encryption protocols, the requirement that communications be conducted in specialized ritual languages that only authorized priests understood. This interpretation aligns with evidence from the Mesopotamian scribal schools, where priests underwent decades of training to master the complex linguistic formulas required for temple rituals. These formulas were not simply ancient languages, they were technical vocabularies, specialized terminologies for describing and activating systems that ordinary humans were not meant to understand. The Egyptian priestly training systems show parallel characteristics. The hieroglyphic writing system preserved in temple contexts differs significantly from the simplified hieratic and demotic scripts used for everyday communication. The temple hieroglyphs incorporate mathematical and astronomical notation, encoded symbolic references, and multi-layered meanings that require specialized knowledge to interpret correctly. The pyramid texts inscribed in the burial chamber of Pharaoh Unas during the 5th dynasty contain passages that describe the deceased king's journey to join the Neteru in the sky, but the texts also include what appear to be operational instructions, procedures for accessing specific locations, passwords for passing through checkpoints, warnings about dangers that await those who lack proper authorization. One passage, known as the Cannibal Hymn, describes the pharaoh as consuming the divine essence of the Neteru to acquire their knowledge and capabilities. The language is disturbing enough that many translations soften it, but the original Egyptian is explicit about ritualistic consumption of divine beings. This may be metaphorical, or it may describe actual procedures for transferring biological or technological enhancements from one entity to another. The genetic component of these authority transfers appears repeatedly in sources from multiple cultures. The texts consistently emphasize bloodline purity in royal and priestly families. Marriages were carefully controlled, often requiring unions between close relatives to maintain genetic characteristics that were considered essential for communication with divine authorities. The Egyptian pharaohs practiced brother-sister marriage for this reason. The practice was not merely cultural tradition, it was genetic maintenance, preservation of specific hereditary traits that enabled interaction with the Neteru. The results were biologically problematic, producing high rates of genetic disorders, but the practice continued for millennia because the alternative was losing the ability to communicate with the sources of authority. The Mesopotamian royal families followed similar practices. The cuneiform texts specify that certain priestly positions could only be held by individuals who descended from particular bloodlines. These were not honorary titles, they were technical qualifications. The tablets describe how specific families maintained the knowledge necessary for operating temple communication systems, and this knowledge was transmitted through hereditary channels. But there is evidence that these bloodline requirements were not merely about preserving training traditions. The texts suggest that certain individuals possessed physiological characteristics that enabled them to interface with technologies that were inaccessible to ordinary humans. The tablets of destinies, described as devices that granted control over natural forces, apparently required biometric authentication. They would respond only to operators whose genetic markers matched authorization protocols. This explains why these devices could not simply be stolen and used by anyone who possessed them. The Epic of Anzu describes how the bird demon's theft of the tablets produced chaos rather than transferred authority. The devices recognized that the holder was unauthorized and failed to function properly. The formal authority transfer ceremonies described in Mesopotamian texts involve physical contact between the tablets and the human recipients. The Mari throne room evidence suggests that this contact produced measurable energy discharge, possibly the activation of latent genetic modifications, possibly the imprinting of command authorization into nervous systems that had been engineered with receiver capabilities. Modern genetic research has identified anomalous DNA sequences in certain human populations that appear to have no clear evolutionary pathway. These sequences are most prevalent in populations descended from the ancient Near East, suggesting possible hereditary continuity from the royal and priestly bloodlines that the ancient texts describe as having been modified for specific purposes. The implications are uncomfortable. If the texts describe actual genetic engineering programs, then certain human bloodlines were deliberately designed to serve as interfaces between the Watchers and general human populations. These modified individuals would possess capabilities that ordinary humans lacked: enhanced cognitive function, extended lifespan, or biological mechanisms that enabled them to perceive or interact with technologies that were invisible to others. The cuneiform texts indicate that these enhanced bloodlines were concentrated in specific geographical regions: the northern territories under Anu's authority, the central plains under Enlil's control, the southern regions governed by Enki. Each maintained separate populations with distinct genetic characteristics suited to their particular administrative functions. Over time, these populations mixed. The genetic boundaries broke down through migration, conquest, and unauthorized reproduction. The texts describe this mixing as a recurring problem that required periodic intervention to correct. The flood represented the most extreme correction. It saw a complete reset that eliminated corrupted bloodlines and re-established controlled populations from preserved genetic samples. But the mixing continued in the post-flood period. The texts document ongoing efforts to maintain bloodline purity in royal families, while the general population became increasingly hybridized. The result was a gradual dilution of the enhanced characteristics, a slow drift toward genetic configurations that no longer match the original design specifications. The Watchers responded by withdrawing further from direct human contact. The texts from later periods describe fewer face-to-face encounters, more mediated communications, longer intervals between divine interventions. The impression is of a management system struggling to maintain control over populations that were drifting outside the parameters the system was designed to govern. By the first millennium BC, the cuneiform texts describe the Anunnaki as having largely ceased direct involvement in human affairs. The priestly classes continued to perform the rituals, maintain the communication protocols, and preserve the knowledge systems, but the responses from the underground installations became less frequent and less specific. The question is whether this represented an actual withdrawal or merely a change in communication methods. The texts are ambiguous. They describe the Watchers as having departed to their own place, but they also indicate that the underground installations remained operational, that the mountain sanctuaries continued to be maintained, that certain forbidden territories were still enforced. There is a possibility that creates a particular kind of unease. Perhaps the Watchers did not leave. Perhaps they simply stopped responding. The silence appears gradually in the historical record. The later Babylonian texts, those composed during the first millennium BC, show a shift in tone when describing interactions with divine authorities. The earlier texts had recorded direct dialogues, specific instructions, immediate responses to ritual communications. The later texts describe prayers offered into silence, divination techniques used to interpret ambiguous signs, and increasing reliance on inherited knowledge rather than fresh revelation. The rituals continued. The temples remained operational. The priestly classes maintained their training programs, and preserved the ancient formulas, but the sense of active presence diminished. The texts begin using past tense when describing the Anunnaki, speaking of what they did during earlier ages rather than what they currently do. This shift coincides with changes in the archaeological record. The great ziggurat construction programs ended. The massive irrigation projects that had required coordination across vast territories became localized. The astronomical observation programs that had produced increasingly precise calculations of celestial phenomena plateaued, then gradually declined as the knowledge keepers died without replacing their expertise. The cuneiform tradition itself began to fade. Fewer scribes trained in the ancient languages. Fewer tablets were produced. The great libraries at Nineveh and Babylon continued to preserve old texts, but the production of new technical documents decreased sharply. By the Persian period, much of the ancient knowledge had become opaque, even to the priests who maintained the rituals. But certain installations remained active. The texts from the Seleucid period, the final centuries of cuneiform writing before it disappeared entirely, still reference underground chambers that required restricted access, still describe mountain sanctuaries where unauthorized approach resulted in documented consequences. The enforcement mechanisms apparently continued functioning even as the broader communication systems fell silent. The Hebrew prophetic literature from this same period describes divine beings in terms that suggest physical presence rather than abstract spiritual entities. Ezekiel's vision, recorded during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC, describes craft with rotating wheels, beings with multiple faces, structures with crystalline appearance, and metallic components. The language struggles to describe what Ezekiel witnessed, reaching for comparisons like burnished bronze, like glowing metal, like sapphire, that suggest advanced technology rendered in vocabulary designed for Bronze Age material culture. The Book of Daniel, composed during the 2nd century BC, describes encounters with beings called Watchers, using terminology that traces directly back to the Akkadian Ig. These Watchers issue decrees that affect earthly kingdoms, suggesting continued administrative authority over human political structures. The text does not present them as distant or abstract. They appear, deliver messages, and depart, operating with the efficiency of officials executing predetermined protocols. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve additional texts that were not included in the standard biblical canon. Among these, the Book of Giants describes the Nephilim, offspring of the Watchers, as possessing knowledge that allowed them to perceive the true nature of reality. The text says these beings had disturbing dreams in which they saw the coming destruction and understood that their existence violated protocols that could not be permanently evaded. The scrolls also preserve additional fragments of the Enochic literature that describe the underground imprisonment of the rebellious Watchers in more geographic detail. The texts specify locations: valleys in the regions near the Dead Sea, chambers beneath mountain ranges in the territories east of Babylon, sealed installations in the northern regions near the Caucasus. These are not mythological underworlds, they are geographical coordinates. Archaeological surveys of some of these regions have revealed anomalies. Ground-penetrating radar has detected large void spaces beneath areas where no known excavation has occurred. Seismic studies show cavities at depths that exceed any documented ancient mining operations. The geological explanations for these voids are uncertain. Natural cave formations in regions where the rock layers typically don't produce caves, erosion patterns that don't match water flow, structural features that suggest artificial excavation. Access to these sites is often restricted. Some are in military zones, others are in politically sensitive territories where archaeological investigation is unwelcome, a few have been explored unofficially, producing accounts that are difficult to verify, descriptions of sealed passages, metallic surfaces that don't corrode, chambers with artificial lighting that has no apparent power source. These accounts exist at the margins of archaeology, dismissed by mainstream researchers as misidentifications or fabrications, but they persist. Multiple independent reports from different time periods describing similar features in locations that correspond to the ancient texts. The pattern suggests the possibility that the underground installations described in cuneiform and Hebrew sources remain physically intact, that the chambers carved beneath ancient cities and mountain sanctuaries have not collapsed or filled with sediment, that they continue to exist, sealed but functional, maintained by mechanisms that do not require human intervention. The ancient texts indicate that the imprisoned watchers were bound for specific durations, periods measured in generations or cosmic cycles that would eventually expire. The Book of Enoch describes their punishment as lasting until the final judgment, but other texts suggest shorter terms. The Mesopotamian sources describe banishment periods that would end when certain astronomical conditions recurred, when particular stellar configurations returned, when specific planetary alignments repeated. These astronomical cycles operate on timescales that dwarf human historical memory. The precession of the equinoxes completes a full cycle every 26,000 years. The Mesopotamian astronomical texts track this precession with precision that suggests they understood its implications: the changing position of the celestial pole, the slow drift of stellar positions, the long-term patterns that remain invisible to civilizations that only observe for centuries. If the Watcher's imprisonment or withdrawal was keyed to such cycles, then their return would occur on schedules that bear no relationship to human political or religious calendars. The ancient texts might describe events separated from our era by such vast time spans that the entire recorded history of civilization represents merely an interim period, a pause between active phases of whatever program the Watchers were administering. The mathematical knowledge preserved in ancient sources supports this long cycle interpretation. The Mayan calendar, famous for its supposed prediction of catastrophe in 2012, actually tracks multiple overlapping cycles, including a long count that spans 5,125 years. But the Mayan texts also describe longer cycles, the Great Cycle of 26,000 years that corresponds precisely to the precessional period that Mesopotamian astronomers calculated. The coincidence is striking. Two civilizations separated by oceans and millennia, both tracking the same astronomical cycle with the same mathematical precision. The independent discovery explanation becomes increasingly strained when the calculations match to multiple decimal places. The Egyptian astronomical ceilings in temples like Dendera display similar knowledge. The zodiacal representations show stellar positions that predate the temple construction by thousands of years, suggesting that the astronomical knowledge was inherited from earlier sources rather than derived from contemporary observations. The precision of these star maps indicates access to long-term observational data that individual human lifespans could not have accumulated. This preserved astronomical knowledge implies continuity of observation across periods when human civilization supposedly did not exist. The data had to come from somewhere. It had to be collected, calculated, and recorded by entities capable of maintaining observational programs that spanned millennia. The ancient texts attribute this knowledge to the Watchers. They describe it as part of the forbidden instruction, the revelation of celestial mechanics that allowed humans to calculate not merely the movements of planets, but the long-term patterns that governed cosmic cycles. The text suggests that this knowledge was forbidden because it revealed the timescales on which the Watchers themselves operated. Understanding those timescales would allow humans to calculate when interventions might recur, when the communication silence might end, when the sealed installations might be reopened. The knowledge itself represented a form of power, the ability to anticipate rather than merely react to events initiated by non-human intelligences. The cuneiform texts describe the me, the fundamental decrees that governed reality, as including principles of time manipulation, the ability to perceive events before they occurred, to see across the waters of time, as the Uruk tablet phrases it. This was not mere prophecy. The texts describe it as a technology, a capability that required understanding of temporal mechanics that human physics is only beginning to conceptualize. If the Watchers possessed such capabilities, then their withdrawal may not have been a simple departure. It may have been a temporal repositioning, a shift to a different time frame from which they could observe human development without direct interaction. From such a position, they could monitor multiple time periods, simultaneously intervening only when necessary to correct deviations from planned trajectories. This interpretation aligns with descriptions in the prophetic literature of divine beings who perceive past, present, and future simultaneously, who announce events centuries before they occur, who describe human history as a completed narrative rather than an unfolding process. The language suggests observers positioned outside the temporal flow that constrains human perception. The implications shift depending on whether the silence represents true absence or merely non-interaction. If the Watchers departed entirely, then the ancient knowledge systems they established have been running on autopilot for millennia, degrading slowly as the genetic bloodlines dilute and the technical understanding fades. If they remain present but non-responsive, then the silence itself may be intentional, an experiment in allowing human civilization to develop without direct supervision. The texts do not resolve this question. They describe both possibilities. Some passages suggest complete withdrawal. Others describe continued observation from concealed positions. The ambiguity may be deliberate, or it may reflect the fact that the human scribes who recorded these traditions did not themselves understand the full nature of what they were documenting. What remains certain is that the ancient world believed the Watchers were real, not metaphors, not spiritual abstractions, but physical entities with technological capabilities and administrative authority over human populations. The consistency of this belief across multiple independent cultures suggests either unprecedented coordination in mythological fabrication or shared experience of phenomena that the conventional historical narrative has not accounted for. And in the preserved texts, there is a recurring theme that creates a particular kind of tension. The Watchers are described as planning in terms of generations and ages. Their programs operate on timescales that make individual human lives irrelevant to their calculations. But those programs apparently include checkpoints, moments when they reassess, intervene, adjust. The question is whether we are approaching one of those moments. The checkpoints described in the ancient texts correspond to astronomical events that occur with mathematical regularity. The cuneiform tablets from Babylon contain ephemeris calculations, predictions of planetary positions centuries in advance, that demonstrate understanding of celestial mechanics sufficient to identify future alignments that would not recur for thousands of years. These calculations were not academic exercises. The ritual texts specify that certain ceremonies could only be performed during particular astronomical configurations. The timing was not symbolic. The texts indicate that communication systems required specific celestial alignments to function properly, suggesting that the technology involved depended on astronomical positioning in ways that modern physics is only beginning to understand through quantum entanglement and gravitational wave research. The Mesopotamian Emul Apin tablets, dating to approximately 1000 BC but preserving much earlier astronomical knowledge, contain star catalogues that track the positions of specific celestial bodies with precision that requires centuries of continuous observation. The tablets also describe omens associated with planetary conjunctions, events when multiple planets align in ways that occur infrequently enough to be notable. But the omen literature treats these conjunctions as triggers rather than mere signs. The texts describe specific conjunctions as opening windows for divine action, as moments when communication becomes possible, as times when the boundaries between terrestrial and celestial domains become permeable. The language suggests that these astronomical events produced actual changes in physical conditions rather than simply providing symbolic timing. The Hebrew prophetic texts contain similar timing mechanisms. Daniel's prophecies specify durations measured in days and weeks of years, mathematical formulas that calculate future events based on starting points tied to historical occurrences. The precision of these calculations suggests that they were derived from systems designed to track long-term cycles, not from mystical revelation. The Book of Enoch describes a complex astronomical calendar that tracks solar, lunar and stellar cycles simultaneously. The Enochic calendar uses a 364-day year divided into 4 equal seasons, with intercalation mechanisms to maintain alignment with solar cycles. This calendar differs from both the lunar calendars used by most ancient cultures and the solar calendar that would eventually become standard. Its purpose appears to be maintaining synchronization with celestial events that were significant to the watchers rather than to human agricultural or religious needs. The Dead Sea Scroll community that preserved the Enochic texts used this calendar for their ritual timing. They considered the lunar calendars used by the Jerusalem temple establishment to be corrupted, not merely incorrect but deliberately falsified to prevent humans from tracking the actual cycles that govern divine intervention. The community texts describe their calendar as the true reckoning, the system revealed by the Watchers before their imprisonment. This dispute over calendars appears trivial until examined in the context of the ancient text's insistence that precise timing was essential for communication with divine authorities. If the calendar used by the mainstream religious establishment no longer synchronized with the astronomical events that activated the ancient communication systems, then the rituals performed at the Jerusalem temple would fail to connect with their intended recipients. The prayers would be offered at the wrong times, during windows when the systems were inactive. The Qumran community believed this disconnect was deliberate. Their texts describe a conspiracy to prevent ordinary humans from accessing the knowledge necessary for direct communication with the Watchers. By corrupting the calendar, the religious authorities maintained their monopoly on mediation, ensuring that any contact with divine entities would occur only through authorized channels that they controlled. Whether or not such a conspiracy existed, the mathematical evidence supports the possibility that different calendars would produce different results when used for timing astronomical observations. The precession of the equinoxes means that stellar positions shift slowly over centuries. A calendar that accurately marked celestial events in 4000 BC would be progressively misaligned by 500 BC, requiring corrections that would only be made if the observers understood the precessional mechanism. The Mesopotamian astronomers did understand precession. Their tablets track the slow drift of stellar positions and provide correction factors. But this knowledge apparently did not transfer completely to later cultures. The Greek astronomers would not rediscover precession until Hipparchus in the 2nd century BC, by which time the cuneiform tradition was nearly extinct. The loss of this astronomical knowledge had practical implications. If the ancient communication systems required precise celestial timing, then civilizations that no longer understood the correct calculations would be unable to activate those systems even if they maintained the rituals. The technology would become inaccessible not because it was destroyed, but because the operational knowledge was lost. This scenario matches the pattern observed in the archaeological record. The ziggurats continued to be maintained long after the theological understanding behind them had faded. The priests continued performing rituals whose original purpose they no longer comprehended. The ancient texts were copied and recopied, but the technical terminology became increasingly corrupted as scribes who did not understand the concepts made errors that subsequent generations propagated. By the time cuneiform writing disappeared entirely in the 1st century AD, the operational knowledge of the ancient systems had been effectively erased. The physical structures remained, the ziggurats, the underground chambers, the mountain installations, but the ability to use them was gone. The technology became archaeology, its purpose reduced to speculation. Yet certain traditions persisted in fragmented form. The medieval grimoires, texts describing procedures for contacting non-human intelligences, preserve rituals that show clear derivation from Mesopotamian and Egyptian sources. The ceremonial magic traditions of Renaissance Europe incorporated astronomical timing, specific linguistic formulas, and geometric diagrams that trace back through Arabic translations to original cuneiform sources. These grimoires describe procedures for contacting beings called angels, demons, or spirits, entities that, when their described characteristics are examined closely, correspond remarkably to the Mesopotamian Igigi and the Hebrew Watchers. The rituals specify exact timing based on planetary positions, require complex geometric constructions, and emphasize the importance of precise pronunciation of names that are clearly corrupted versions of Sumerian and Akkadian terms. The mainstream religious traditions dismiss these practices as superstition or heresy, but the persistence of the traditions across centuries suggests that some practitioners achieved results significant enough to maintain the practices despite official opposition. The accounts describe communications with entities that provided information, demonstrated capabilities, or produced effects that the practitioners attributed to the summoned beings. Whether these communications actually contacted the ancient watchers or accessed something else entirely remains uncertain. The descriptions in the grimoires are consistent with the ancient texts' accounts of how communication systems functioned: precise timing, correct linguistic formulas, specific ritual procedures. But without understanding the underlying mechanisms, it is impossible to determine whether the Renaissance magicians were activating genuine ancient technology or merely experiencing psychological phenomena produced by elaborate ceremonial procedures. The scientific revolution of the 17th century marked a decisive shift away from these practices toward mechanistic explanations of natural phenomena. The ancient knowledge systems were reclassified as primitive superstition, interesting only as historical curiosities. The possibility that the texts described actual technologies became intellectually unacceptable. But the archaeological discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries created new problems for the dismissive interpretation. The precision of ancient astronomical observations, the sophistication of mathematical calculations preserved in cuneiform tablets, the engineering capabilities demonstrated in megalithic constructions. These findings forced recognition that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge that the conventional narrative had not accounted for. The standard response has been to extend the timeline of human development, to argue that ancient peoples were more sophisticated than previously believed. that conventional tools and methods could produce the observed results given sufficient time and effort, that independent invention can explain the similarities across distant cultures. But each new discovery makes this explanation more strained. The precision increases beyond what bronze and copper tools should achieve. The mathematical sophistication exceeds what civilizations with the documented lifespans of their scholars should have accumulated. The coordination across vast distances requires communication technologies that the archaeological record does not show. The ancient texts offer a different explanation. They attribute the knowledge to transmission from non-human sources. They describe teaching programs, technology transfers, genetic modifications designed to create human populations capable of utilizing advanced systems. They present a framework in which human civilization was not an independent development, but a managed project. This framework is rejected not because the evidence contradicts it, but because the implications are unacceptable. If the ancient accounts are accurate, then human history is not the story of autonomous development from primitive origins to technological sophistication. It is the story of a managed population, genetically modified and culturally programmed by entities whose origins, purposes, and current locations remain unknown. The silence of the Watchers since the classical period could represent the conclusion of their program, or it could represent a waiting period, a phase during which humanity develops under reduced supervision to determine whether the genetic modifications and knowledge transfers produced a population capable of independent progress. The astronomical cycles continue. The precessional drift moves the celestial pole through its 26,000-year circuit. The planetary conjunctions that the ancient texts marked as significant will recur. If the communication systems were key to these cycles, then the windows for contact will open again, according to mathematical inevitability. The question is whether anyone will recognize those windows when they occur, whether the knowledge necessary to activate the ancient systems has been sufficiently preserved in the fragmented traditions, the corrupted texts, the half-understood rituals that survive the millennia of silence, or whether the systems will activate themselves. The possibility of autonomous activation appears in the ancient texts as a safeguard mechanism. The Mesopotamian accounts describe systems designed to function without human intervention, automatic processes that would trigger when specific conditions were met, regardless of whether anyone was actively monitoring them. The tablets of destinies are described as possessing this autonomous capability. The texts indicate that these devices did not merely respond to commands from authorized operators. They also executed predetermined protocols when environmental or temporal conditions matched program parameters. The Epic of Anzu describes how the tablets continued affecting natural systems, even while in the possession of an unauthorized holder who did not understand their operation. This suggests technology that incorporated decision-making capabilities, systems that could assess conditions, compare them against stored criteria, and initiate responses without requiring external instruction. The cuneiform terminology for these capabilities uses words that translates as knowing or seeing, suggesting artificial intelligence or autonomous monitoring systems embedded in the devices. The underground installations described in multiple sources may incorporate similar autonomous functions. The ventilation systems that maintain air circulation for millennia without apparent power sources or human maintenance suggest self-regulating mechanisms. The enforcement protocols that reportedly continue protecting forbidden territories despite the absence of visible guardians imply automated defense systems. If such systems exist, they would continue operating according to their original programming, regardless of human awareness or intention. They would monitor for specified conditions, astronomical alignments, genetic markers in human populations, technological development thresholds, and initiate predetermined responses when those conditions occurred. The ancient texts describe several categories of automated responses, protective measures that prevent unauthorized access to restricted knowledge or locations, communication protocols that activate during specific temporal windows to deliver stored messages, corrective interventions designed to adjust human development trajectories that deviate beyond acceptable parameters. This last category is the most significant. The flood narrative represents one such corrective intervention, a reset triggered when human development exceeded the boundaries the Watchers had established. The texts describe this as a decision made by the Divine Council, but they also indicate that the option was built into the system from the beginning. The capacity for catastrophic population reduction was apparently a designed feature, not an improvised response. The post-flood texts describe modified protocols that would make such extreme interventions unnecessary. The genetic limitations imposed on human populations, reduced lifespans, constrained cognitive capabilities, were designed to prevent the accumulation of knowledge and capability that had necessitated the earlier reset. The new parameters would keep human civilization within manageable bounds indefinitely, but those parameters assumed that the genetic modifications would remain stable across generations. The texts indicate concern about genetic drift, about the gradual dilution of the control mechanisms through population mixing and mutation. The priestly bloodline maintenance programs were attempts to preserve at least some populations that retained the designed characteristics. Over millennia, however, even carefully maintained bloodlines diverge from their original specifications. Mutations accumulate, environmental factors alter gene expression. The human genome that exists today differs significantly from the genomes that existed 3,000 years ago, which differed from those that existed 6,000 years ago. If the Watchers' control systems relied on specific genetic markers to identify authorized versus unauthorized individuals, those recognition systems may no longer function correctly. Modern humans may not register as the populations the systems were designed to manage. We may appear to the ancient monitoring systems as something unexpected, a deviation that triggers diagnostic protocols or corrective responses. This possibility creates a particular kind of uncertainty. Unknown systems, operating according to unknown criteria, monitoring for conditions we cannot identify. If such systems exist and remain active, then humanity is subject to controls we do not understand and cannot predict. The alternative possibility is that the systems have degraded or failed over the millennia of operation without maintenance, that the underground installations have fallen silent, the monitoring networks have stopped functioning, the automated protocols have exhausted their power sources or suffered component failures that rendered them inoperative. This scenario is equally uncertain. Failed control systems could be safer than functional ones, or more dangerous, if failure modes include uncontrolled release of contained hazards or activation of fail-safe destruction protocols. The ancient texts provide hints about failure conditions. The Book of Enoch describes the imprisoned Watchers as straining against their bonds, weakening the seals that contain them. The Mesopotamian texts describe divine beings whose confinement was meant to last for specific durations, implying that the containment systems had designed expiration dates. If those durations were measured in precessional cycles or other long-term astronomical periods, then the expiration dates may not have occurred yet, or they may be imminent. The texts do not provide absolute chronological anchors that would allow precise calculation of when the specified periods would elapse. The mathematical sophistication of the astronomical knowledge preserved in ancient sources suggests that the Watchers understood celestial mechanics well enough to calculate future alignments across tens of thousands of years. If they designed systems to activate at specific future dates, they possessed the knowledge necessary to set those timers accurately. Modern astronomical calculations allow us to determine when specific celestial configurations will recur. The precessional cycle's current position can be calculated precisely. The major planetary conjunctions that occur rarely enough to serve as temporal markers can be predicted centuries in advance. If we understood which alignments the ancient systems considered significant, we could potentially determine when autonomous activation protocols might trigger. But that knowledge is precisely what was lost when the cuneiform tradition disappeared. The astronomical texts were copied, but the interpretive keys, the information about which calculations were merely observational and which were operationally important, were not adequately preserved. The medieval and Renaissance attempts to reconstruct this knowledge through the grimoire traditions apparently recovered some fragments. The emphasis on planetary timing in ceremonial magic suggests that practitioners understood that specific astronomical conditions were necessary for the procedures to function. But whether they understood why those conditions mattered, or whether they were simply following inherited instructions without comprehension, remains unclear. The scientific astronomy that developed during the Enlightenment abandoned the astrological framework that had preserved the ancient timing knowledge. The focus shifted to understanding celestial mechanics as physics problems, without regard for whether specific alignments had operational significance beyond their gravitational effects. This shift was intellectually productive. It led to Newton's laws, to orbital mechanics, to modern cosmology, but it also severed the connection to whatever operational knowledge the ancient astronomical traditions had preserved. The timing systems became invisible to scientific analysis because science was not looking for them. Recent developments in archaeoastronomy have begun to reconstruct some of this lost knowledge. Researchers have demonstrated that ancient monuments encode sophisticated astronomical alignments, not merely solstice and equinox markers, but complex calculations involving planetary cycles, stellar precession, and eclipse predictions. The precision of these alignments indicates that the ancient builders possessed detailed knowledge of celestial mechanics and considered the astronomical functions of these structures to be critically important. The structures were not merely temples or tombs. They were instruments, devices designed to mark, measure, or perhaps interact with specific celestial phenomena. If these structures incorporated communication or monitoring functions, then they may still be operational. Stone circles, megalithic chambers, pyramid complexes, distributed across the planet in a network whose extent and interconnection we are only beginning to map. The conventional interpretation treats these as independent developments by unrelated cultures, but the mathematical and astronomical similarities suggest possible coordination. A globally distributed network of astronomical monitoring stations would make sense for entities operating on the timescales the ancient texts describe. Individual structures might fail, but the network as a whole would remain functional. Local knowledge might be lost, but the system would continue operating according to its embedded protocols. The ancient texts describe the Watchers as having established their initial installations on mountain peaks, elevated locations, with clear horizon views necessary for astronomical observation. Many of the world's oldest religious sites occupy such locations. Mount Hermon, the Caucasus Peaks, the Zagros Highlands, the Andean summits. The consistent pattern suggests systematic site selection based on observational requirements. These sites remain sacred in modern religious traditions, Though the original purposes are long forgotten, pilgrimages continue, rituals are performed. The sites retain cultural significance, even though the knowledge systems that originally established them have disappeared. But significance persists for reasons. Places become sacred because something happened there, because something was experienced, because results were obtained that made the locations important enough to remember across generations. The persistence of sanctity suggests that something about these locations continues to be functionally relevant. Whether that relevance is psychological, the human tendency to maintain traditions, or technological, the continued operation of ancient systems that produce detectable effects, cannot be determined without investigation that the site's sacred status often prevents. The question of autonomous activation becomes more urgent as human technological capability increases. If ancient monitoring systems are tracking human development, then recent advances may be approaching thresholds that trigger programmed responses. The exponential growth of computing power, the development of genetic engineering, the expansion into space. These developments might register to ancient monitoring systems as significant threshold crossings. The text described the Watchers as having been particularly concerned with preventing humans from acquiring certain categories of knowledge. The Enochic tradition emphasizes the prohibition against teaching metallurgy, astronomy, and genetic manipulation, precisely the technologies that define modern civilization. If autonomous systems are monitoring for human acquisition of these technologies, then we may have already crossed the thresholds that would trigger ancient protocols. The responses might already be in progress, unfolding according to timescales that make them invisible to human observers, watching for immediate cause and effect. Or the systems may be waiting for additional conditions to be met, for specific astronomical alignments to occur, for genetic markers in human populations to reach particular distributions, for technological capabilities to achieve defined levels. The uncertainty is embedded in the nature of the situation. We are potentially subject to monitoring and control systems whose existence remains unconfirmed, whose operational status is unknown, whose activation criteria we cannot identify, and whose responses we would not recognize until they were already underway. The ancient texts were attempts to preserve knowledge about these systems, but the texts are fragmentary, corrupted, translated through languages whose technical terminology we do not fully understand. We are trying to reconstruct operational manuals from poetry, technical specifications from mythology, control protocols from religious commandments. And the question that sits quietly beneath the analysis is whether the difficulty of reconstruction is accidental or intentional. The intentional obscuring of knowledge appears as a recurring theme in the ancient texts. The Book of Enoch explicitly describes how certain watchers taught humanity forbidden knowledge, while others worked to conceal or confuse that knowledge to prevent its misuse. The distinction suggests internal disagreement among the watchers about how much humans should be allowed to understand. Enki, in the Mesopotamian tradition, is consistently portrayed as the advocate for human advancement. He provides warnings about the flood, teaches the arts of civilization, and opposes measures designed to keep humans ignorant and controlled. Enlil represents the opposing position: strict management, population control, limitation of human capability to ensure continued administrative oversight. This philosophical divide produced practical consequences. The texts describe how knowledge was simultaneously preserved and encrypted. The astronomical calculations were recorded but embedded in astrological frameworks that obscured their operational significance. The genetic information was documented but expressed in mythological narratives that prevented direct application. The technological specifications were preserved but distributed across multiple disconnected sources that would require extensive synthesis to reconstruct. The structure of the cuneiform libraries suggests deliberate compartmentalization. Different categories of texts were stored in separate locations, maintained by different priestly classes, accessible only to specialists who had undergone specific training. No single individual or institution possessed complete knowledge of the systems. The fragmentation ensured that even if one archive was destroyed or one priestly line ended, the totality of the knowledge could not be lost or misused. But this protective fragmentation also made the knowledge vulnerable to gradual erosion. As individual archives were destroyed, as priestly traditions ended without successfully transmitting their specialized knowledge, the pieces disappeared. The synthesis became progressively more difficult until eventually the connections between fragments were lost entirely. By the Hellenistic period, Greek scholars attempting to understand Mesopotamian knowledge systems were working with incomplete fragments. They could access astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, mythological narratives, but the integrative framework that explained how these related to each other was already disappearing. The knowledge became categorized as separate disciplines: astronomy, mathematics, mythology, medicine, each studied independently without recognition of the underlying unity. This disciplinary fragmentation has persisted into modern scholarship. Archaeologists study the physical remains, linguists translate the texts, astronomers analyse the mathematical tablets, religious scholars interpret the mythological narratives. But the synthesis that would reveal the operational nature of the integrated system remains elusive. The academic specialisation that enables deep expertise in narrow domains simultaneously prevents the cross-disciplinary synthesis necessary for understanding systems that were designed to operate as unified technologies. The ancient texts indicate that this fragmentation would occur. The later Mesopotamian sources describe a predicted decline in knowledge, a gradual forgetting that would eventually reduce the great wisdom of the ancient world to confused legends. The texts frame this as inevitable consequence of the Watcher's withdrawal and the imposition of limited human lifespans that prevented knowledge accumulation across generations. But some passages suggest the decline was not merely predicted but planned, that the knowledge would be allowed to fade until humanity reached a specific developmental stage, at which point retrieval would become possible for those who had developed the capability to use it responsibly. This interpretation implies a test mechanism, knowledge preserved but encoded in ways that prevent access until the accessing civilization has achieved sufficient technological and ethical development to handle what the knowledge reveals. The fragmentation and encryption serve as difficulty filters, barriers that can only be overcome by civilizations that have reached specified capability thresholds. Modern archaeology's ability to read cuneiform, to analyze ancient DNA, to use ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery for discovering buried structures. These capabilities would have been incomprehensible to scholars even a century ago. The technological development that enables us to recover and analyze ancient information has reached levels that may satisfy some of the threshold criteria the ancient systems required. But technological capability is only one criterion. The texts emphasize ethical preparation as equally essential. The Watcher's initial decision to teach humanity was controversial, precisely because it was unclear whether humans possess the ethical capacity to use advanced knowledge without destroying themselves. The flood was triggered by humans demonstrating that they did not possess such capacity. That genetic enhancement without ethical development produced catastrophic results. The post-flood modifications were designed to slow development, to ensure that technological capability and ethical capacity would advance together at rates that would prevent premature access to dangerous knowledge. The reduced lifespans forced each generation to relearn foundational principles, preventing the rapid knowledge accumulation that had characterized the pre-flood period. But this mechanism assumed that ethical development would occur faster than technological development, that wisdom would accumulate even as specific technical knowledge had to be continually relearned. The ancient texts suggest that previous cycles had demonstrated this pattern. Civilizations would develop technology rapidly, but wisdom slowly, eventually reaching crises that required intervention. The modern era presents a version of this problem. Technological capability has advanced exponentially, while ethical frameworks struggle to keep pace. We possess the ability to manipulate genetics, alter climate, engineer pandemics, develop artificial intelligence, capabilities that the ancient texts describe as precisely the knowledge categories the Watchers considered too dangerous for unsupervised human access. If monitoring systems are tracking this development, then our current situation may represent exactly the scenario the ancient control mechanisms were designed to address: rapid technological advance without corresponding ethical development, the pattern that previously triggered corrective interventions. The question is what form such interventions would take. The texts describe multiple options: direct contact to provide guidance, catastrophic reset to eliminate dangerous populations, gradual influence through selected intermediaries, or simple observation to determine whether the civilization will self-correct or self-destruct. Some researchers have suggested that the modern UFO phenomenon represents resumed Watcher activity, monitoring of human civilization by entities using technologies that appear advanced but not incomprehensible. The descriptions in contemporary encounter reports show interesting parallels to ancient accounts: craft with unusual flight characteristics, beings with enhanced capabilities, communications that emphasize warnings about human technological development, abduction accounts that include genetic procedures. The mainstream scientific community dismisses these parallels as coincidental, arguing that modern encounter reports are culturally influenced by ancient texts rather than describing similar phenomena. But the consistency of certain details across cultures that had no contact with each other suggests the possibility of shared experience rather than mere cultural transmission. The ancient texts provide a framework for interpreting such experiences as contact with monitoring systems rather than spiritual or extraterrestrial visitations. If the Watchers established permanent installations on Earth and designed monitoring networks to track human development, then periodic contact would be expected as part of the monitoring protocol, particularly during periods when development approaches critical thresholds. But this interpretation requires accepting that the ancient texts describe technological realities rather than mythological fantasies. It requires treating the cuneiform accounts of the Anunnaki, the Hebrew descriptions of the Watchers, and the Egyptian records of the Neteru as documentations of actual entities with technological capabilities, administrative authority, and long-term programs for managing human civilization. The academic resistance to this interpretation is understandable. The implications are profoundly destabilizing. If human civilization is a managed project rather than autonomous development, then our understanding of history, religion, and human nature requires fundamental revision. The origin narratives that ground cultural identities, the philosophical frameworks that explain human purpose, the political systems based on assumptions of human sovereignty, all would require re-examination. But resistance based on implications rather than evidence is not intellectually defensible. The question is not whether the conclusions are comfortable, but whether they are supported by the available information. And the available information presents patterns that conventional explanations struggle to account for. The precision of ancient astronomical knowledge exceeds what Bronze Age observation should produce. The mathematical sophistication preserved in cuneiform tablets demonstrates capabilities that required either impossibly long observation programs or access to information sources beyond human discovery. The genetic uniformity of certain ancient populations suggests managed breeding programs rather than natural selection. The sudden appearance of urban civilization in multiple locations without evident precursor stages indicates knowledge transfer from external sources. Each anomaly individually can be explained through special pleading, but the cumulative pattern becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. The ancient texts offer a coherent framework that accounts for all the anomalies simultaneously. Human civilization was established and managed by non-human intelligences who possessed advanced technological capabilities and operated according to long-term programs that spanned millennia. This framework makes testable predictions. If the Watchers establish permanent installations, those installations should be detectable through archaeological investigation of the locations the texts specify. If they implemented genetic modification programs, the signatures of those modifications should appear in ancient DNA analysis. If they designed monitoring systems keyed to astronomical cycles, those systems should become active during predictable celestial alignments. Some of these predictions have been partially tested. Underground chambers have been detected through ground-penetrating radar at locations the texts identify as Watcher installations. Ancient DNA analysis has revealed genetic anomalies in certain populations that are difficult to explain through conventional evolutionary mechanisms. Archaeological sites do encode astronomical alignments with precision that suggests technological rather than merely observational purposes, but comprehensive testing requires access to sites and artifacts that are often restricted for political, religious, or military reasons. The underground installations beneath sacred mountains cannot be excavated without violating cultural sensitivities. The chambers beneath military installations cannot be explored without security clearances. The genetic analysis of certain populations encounters ethical constraints about informed consent and cultural ownership of biological information. These practical barriers mean that the questions remain unresolved. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The frameworks are plausible but not proven. We are left with uncertainty, and with the awareness that the uncertainty may be intentional, part of the design. The ancient texts suggest that full knowledge would not be restored until humanity demonstrated readiness for it. That readiness apparently requires not merely technological capability, but ethical development, not merely individual understanding, but collective wisdom. The barriers to knowledge may be filtering mechanisms that ensure only civilizations that have achieved specified maturity can access the information. If so, then our current inability to definitively resolve these questions may indicate that we have not yet satisfied the criteria, that we remain under observation, our development still being assessed, the final determination not yet made about whether we will be granted full access to the knowledge the Watchers preserved, or whether we will require another corrective intervention. The texts do not specify what form that determination will take, or when it will occur. They simply indicate that it is coming. The timing mechanisms described in the ancient texts operate on multiple overlapping scales. Daily cycles governed ritual timing within temples. Monthly lunar phases determined ceremonial calendars. Annual solar cycles marked agricultural and administrative periods. But beneath these familiar rhythms, the texts describe longer cycles, periods measured in centuries and millennia that governed events of fundamental importance. The Mesopotamian concept of the Shah, a period of 3,600 years, appears repeatedly in calculations related to divine activities. The Sumerian king list uses this unit when describing the reigns of antediluvian rulers, suggesting that it represented a significant operational cycle for the Anunnaki, rather than merely a large number chosen for poetic effect. The precessional cycle of approximately 26,000 years, divided into 12 ages of roughly 2,160 years, each appears in multiple ancient astronomical systems. The Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Mayan calendars all track this cycle with precision. That indicates its importance extended beyond academic interest. The texts suggest that transitions between precessional ages represented threshold moments, periods when the relationship between celestial and terrestrial domains underwent fundamental shifts. We are currently in the transition between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius, a shift that occurs when the position of the vernal equinox moves from one zodiacal constellation to the next due to precessional drift. The exact timing of this transition depends on how constellation boundaries are defined, but most calculations place it within the current century. The ancient texts associate precessional transitions with periods of disruption and transformation. The boundaries between ages are described as unstable times, when old orders collapse and new structures emerge. If the Watchers designed interventions to occur during these transition periods, then the current era would represent a predictable window for resumed activity. The astronomical alignments that will occur during the next several decades include several rare configurations that ancient texts marked as significant. Multiple planetary conjunctions in specific zodiacal positions, eclipse patterns that repeat on century-scale cycles, stellar alignments that occur only during particular precessional ages. If ancient monitoring systems were programmed to activate during these alignments, then we may be approaching multiple trigger points simultaneously. The texts do not describe these activations as sudden dramatic events. Instead, they suggest gradual escalations, increasing frequency of contacts, growing evidence of monitoring activity, progressive revelation of information that had been concealed. The pattern resembles a controlled disclosure process rather than an abrupt unveiling. This gradualism may serve protective purposes. Sudden revelation of comprehensive information about non-human management of human civilization could produce social collapse, panic, religious crisis, political instability. A controlled increase in available evidence allows populations to adjust progressively, to develop explanatory frameworks gradually, to integrate disturbing information without catastrophic disruption. The increasing archaeological evidence of ancient advanced knowledge, the growing recognition that conventional historical narratives have significant gaps, the mainstream discussion of possibilities that were previously confined to fringe speculation. These developments may represent early stages of such a controlled disclosure process. Whether this process is occurring through human archaeological discovery, uncovering information that was always present, or through deliberate revelation by monitoring systems that are choosing to make information accessible, cannot be determined from available evidence. The results would appear similar: a progressive increase in humanity's understanding of its actual history and the forces that shaped its development. The ancient texts indicate that full revelation would occur when humanity demonstrated capacity to handle the information without self-destruction. The criteria apparently include technological maturity, ethical development, and social stability sufficient to integrate paradigm-shifting knowledge without collapse. Our current technological capabilities would have seemed godlike to ancient populations. We possess abilities the texts describe as divine prerogatives: instantaneous communication across vast distances, flight through the air and into space, manipulation of genetic code, creation of artificial intelligences. We have achieved in centuries what took the antediluvian civilizations millennia, precisely the rapid development pattern that previously triggered corrective interventions. But technological capability without ethical wisdom was the problem the flood was designed to solve. The texts emphasize that the Nephilim, the hybrid offspring of the Watchers, possessed great power but lacked the restraint necessary to use it responsibly. Their capabilities exceeded their wisdom, producing conditions that threatened the stability of the entire management program. Modern civilization faces similar imbalances. We possess technologies capable of altering planetary climate, engineering pandemics, creating artificial superintelligences, capabilities that could benefit or destroy human civilization depending on how they are used. The ethical frameworks for governing these technologies lag behind our ability to deploy them. If monitoring systems are assessing human readiness for full knowledge revelation, this ethical lag would register as a significant warning indicator. It would suggest that despite impressive technological progress, humanity has not yet achieved the wisdom necessary for responsible management of advanced capabilities. The texts describe how previous cycles ended when civilizations achieved technological sophistication without corresponding ethical development. The pattern suggests a fundamental challenge. Technological advancement follows exponential curves, while wisdom accumulation follows linear or logarithmic curves. The gap between capability and wisdom grows until it reaches crisis points that require intervention. The question is whether intervention is automatic, triggered by monitoring systems when specified thresholds are crossed, or discretionary, dependent on evaluation by conscious intelligences who assess whether the civilization might self-correct before reaching catastrophic outcomes. The ancient accounts suggest both mechanisms operated simultaneously. Automatic systems maintained basic controls and prevented certain categories of violation, while conscious oversight evaluated broader developmental patterns and made decisions about whether to guide, intervene, or simply observe. If this dual system remains operational, then humanity is subject to both automatic constraints we cannot perceive and evaluative observation by intelligences whose criteria we do not understand. Our technological experiments may be triggering automatic safety protocols without our awareness. Our ethical debates may be monitored by observers assessing whether we are developing adequate wisdom to complement our growing capabilities. The absence of obvious intervention could indicate either that we have not yet crossed critical thresholds, or that the evaluation is still in progress, or that the decision has been made to allow us to proceed without guidance to determine whether we can successfully navigate the challenges through our own development. The ancient text suggests that the Watchers' primary debate centered on this question: should humanity be guided carefully through each developmental stage, or should humans be allowed to make mistakes and learn from consequences, even if those consequences include catastrophic failures? Enki advocated for protective guidance. Enlil argued for strict accountability and natural consequences. The post-flood compromise apparently involved reducing direct intervention while maintaining monitoring and reserve capacity for corrective action if development exceeded acceptable bounds. This framework would produce exactly the pattern observed: long periods of apparent absence, interrupted by occasional contacts during critical junctures. The modern era, with its exponential technological growth and global connectivity, represents precisely the kind of critical juncture the texts describe as requiring evaluation. We are approaching capabilities that could fundamentally alter the human condition: genetic engineering that could modify our species, artificial intelligence that could surpass human cognition, space exploration that could establish populations beyond Earth's surface. Each of these developments crosses boundaries that the ancient texts describe as significant thresholds. The modification of human genetics was the Watcher's exclusive prerogative. Unauthorized genetic manipulation triggered the flood. The creation of non-human intelligences parallels the Watcher's creation of humans, raising questions about whether we are prepared to responsibly manage beings we create. The expansion beyond Earth could either propagate our problems into space or establish populations that escape the control systems designed for Earth-based monitoring. If the Watcher's management program was designed to contain human development within specific parameters, then our current trajectory represents a potential breakout scenario. We are approaching escape velocity from the constraints that have governed human civilization for millennia. The question is whether that escape is premature, whether we are breaking containment before achieving the maturity necessary for safe operation beyond the controlled environment, or whether this represents exactly the developmental milestone the program was designed to produce. The texts provide evidence for both interpretations. Some passages suggest humanity was meant to eventually mature beyond need for supervision, that the management program had graduation conditions that would release humans from oversight once specified criteria were satisfied. Other passages describe permanent limitations designed to ensure humans never achieved full independence. This ambiguity may reflect the disagreement between different Watcher factions. Enki's approach suggested humans should eventually achieve autonomy. Enlil's position implied permanent subordinate status. The compromise that governed post-flood development left the ultimate human destiny unresolved. We may be approaching the point when that question requires final determination. The developmental trajectory we are following will either lead to autonomous civilization capable of independent operation, or to catastrophic failure that demonstrates humans require continued management, or to resume direct oversight that prevents us from discovering whether we could have succeeded independently. The outcome depends partly on choices we make, on whether we develop ethical frameworks adequate for governing our technologies, whether we achieve social cooperation sufficient for managing global challenges, whether we demonstrate wisdom in addition to capability. But it also depends on choices made by entities whose existence remains unconfirmed, operating according to criteria we do not understand, evaluating our development against standards we were never explicitly told we needed to satisfy. The ancient texts were attempts to communicate those standards, to warn future generations about the patterns that led to previous corrective interventions, to preserve knowledge about the management systems so that humanity might eventually understand the context within which our civilization developed. But the texts are fragmentary, corrupted, translated through conceptual frameworks that obscure their technical content. We are trying to extract operational guidance from documents that have passed through dozens of languages, been filtered through religious interpretations, been edited by scribes who did not understand what they were copying. The difficulty of extraction may be part of the design, knowledge preserved but accessible only to civilizations that have developed sufficient capability to reconstruct it from fragmentary evidence. A filter that ensures only mature civilizations gain access to information about the systems governing their development. If we are approaching the threshold where that access becomes possible, then the next period will determine whether we use the knowledge to transcend our limitations, or whether understanding our constraints simply makes us more aware of our confinement. The texts suggest that previous civilizations faced this same realization, that there were cycles before our recorded history when humans achieved sufficient development to understand their situation, recognized they were managed populations rather than autonomous civilizations, and had to decide how to respond to that knowledge. Some apparently chose rebellion, attempts to break free from oversight to seize technologies they were not meant to access, to force their way to independence rather than waiting for it to be granted. The texts describe these rebellions as ending catastrophically. Others apparently chose acceptance, cooperation with the management program, patient development within prescribed boundaries, trust that eventual autonomy would be granted when appropriate. The texts are less clear about the outcomes of these approaches. The question facing modern civilization is which approach to take, assuming the ancient texts describe actual conditions rather than merely inherited fantasies. And that assumption itself represents the critical decision point. The decision about how to interpret the ancient texts cannot be made purely on evidential grounds. The information is insufficient for definitive conclusions. The archaeological evidence is suggestive but fragmentary. The textual accounts are consistent across cultures but open to multiple interpretations. The physical anomalies in ancient sites are remarkable but not conclusive. What makes the interpretation significant is not its certainty, but its implications. If the texts describe mythological constructs reflecting human psychological needs rather than historical events, then they remain valuable as cultural artifacts, but require no modification to our understanding of human origins or development. We continue operating within the framework of autonomous civilization, gradually developing from primitive beginnings. But if the texts document actual management systems established by non-human intelligences, then nearly every assumption underlying modern civilization requires reconsideration. Human sovereignty becomes questionable. Religious traditions become garbled accounts of contact rather than spiritual revelations. Historical progress becomes guided development rather than autonomous achievement. The implications extend to practical questions about current decision-making. If monitoring systems are evaluating human development, then our choices during critical periods carry significance beyond their immediate effects. They serve as demonstrations of our capability and wisdom, evidence that determines whether we receive autonomy, continued guidance, or corrective intervention. This creates a peculiar form of responsibility. We are potentially being tested without knowing the criteria, evaluated without awareness of the standards, judged by observers whose existence we cannot confirm. The appropriate response to such a situation is uncertain. The ancient texts suggest that awareness itself may be part of the evaluation, that civilizations mature enough to recognize their situation, to understand they are potentially managed populations, have reached a developmental stage that qualifies them for different treatment than populations that remain unconscious of their context. This framework implies that the difficulty of interpreting the text is calibrated, that the information is preserved at a level of obscurity that makes it accessible to civilizations that have achieved sufficient analytical capability while remaining invisible to less developed populations. Recognition of the management system becomes a threshold that must be crossed before graduation to autonomy becomes possible. But recognition also creates dangers. Populations that understand they are controlled may resist that control, may attempt to break free prematurely, may develop resentment that destabilizes the management relationship. The texts describe how knowledge of the Watcher's involvement led some humans to challenge their authority, to steal their technologies, to demand explanations and independence. The Watcher's responses to such challenges varied according to the texts. Enki sometimes provided additional information, apparently believing that education would lead to responsible behaviour. Enlil typically responded with punishment, demonstrating that challenges to authority produced consequences that discouraged further resistance. The dynamic resembles parent-child relationships during adolescence, the tension between growing independence and continued need for guidance. modern civilization's relationship to the possibility of watcher oversight follows similar patterns. Some respond with fascination and desire for contact. Others react with resentment at the implication of subordinate status. Still others dismiss the entire framework as fantasy that distracts from more immediate concerns. These varied responses may themselves be evaluated by any monitoring systems that exist. How civilizations react to awareness of potential oversight with curiosity, hostility, denial, or sophisticated analysis demonstrates maturity levels relevant to decisions about future relationship structures. The ancient texts indicate that the Watchers valued certain human qualities: creativity, resilience, capacity for learning, ethical development. These qualities apparently made humans useful for purposes the texts only partially reveal. The creation accounts describe humans as being designed for specific functions: labour, worship, administration of earthly domains on behalf of celestial authorities. But the texts also describe unexpected human capabilities that emerged beyond the original design specifications, artistic creativity that produced beauty the Watchers had not anticipated, emotional complexity that generated experiences the Watchers found valuable, philosophical insight that asked questions the Watchers had not considered. These emergent qualities apparently created debate among the Watchers about humanity's ultimate purpose and potential. Were humans merely sophisticated tools to be maintained within their designed parameters, or had they become something more, beings whose development might lead to capabilities approaching or even exceeding their creators? The text suggests this question remained unresolved. Different Watcher factions held different views. The management program incorporated compromises between positions rather than coherent unified policy. This internal disagreement may explain some of the apparent inconsistencies in how human development was guided, periods of rapid advancement followed by catastrophic resets, knowledge transfers followed by deliberate limitations. If these disagreements continue among whatever Watchers or monitoring systems remain active, then humanity's fate may depend less on our capabilities than on which faction's position prevails in ongoing debates we cannot observe. We may be performing adequately by one set of criteria while failing completely by another, with our ultimate treatment determined by which evaluation framework is given priority. This possibility introduces uncertainty beyond what human agency can control. We can develop our capabilities, refine our ethics, demonstrate our potential, but if the decision about our future rests with entities whose debates and criteria we cannot access, then our performance may be irrelevant to the outcome. The texts provide hints about how to influence those debates. Enki's advocacy for humanity apparently rested on demonstrated human qualities that he found valuable: ingenuity in solving problems, creativity in artistic expression, capacity for emotional connection. Enlil's concerns focused on human deficiencies, tendency toward violence, difficulty maintaining social cooperation, vulnerability to corruption by power. To the extent these characterizations reflect actual criteria being applied, humanity's best strategy involves demonstrating the qualities Enki valued while mitigating the characteristics Enlil considered disqualifying: global cooperation, ethical governance of advanced technologies, creative cultural production, sustainable environmental management. These achievements would presumably strengthen arguments for granting human autonomy. Conversely, patterns that reinforce Enlil's concerns, warfare, environmental destruction, technological recklessness, social fragmentation, would support arguments for continued strict oversight or even corrective intervention. Our collective behaviour serves as evidence in debates whose outcome determines our civilization's trajectory. But this framework assumes the Watchers operate according to rational criteria that can be satisfied through appropriate human behaviour. The text suggests more complex motivations. Some passages describe the Watchers as having emotional investments in human success or failure. Others portray them as executing predetermined programs with bureaucratic indifference. Still others hint at power struggles among Watcher factions where humanity serves as proxy or prize rather than as the primary concern. If human civilization is a project embedded in larger contexts we cannot perceive, then optimizing our development according to what we think are relevant criteria may be irrelevant to decisions being made on different grounds entirely. We may be performing our role adequately while remaining ignorant of what that role actually is. The ancient texts describe humans as having been created to serve Anunnaki purposes, to perform labour, to worship, to maintain earthly domains. But they also describe unexpected human development beyond those original functions. The question is whether that unexpected development represents success, evidence that the human creation project exceeded its design specifications in valuable ways, or failure, demonstration that humans escaped the constraints they were meant to operate within. The answer likely depends on perspective. From Enki's viewpoint, human creativity and independence represented achievements worth nurturing even if they complicated management. From Enlil's perspective, those same qualities represented control problems requiring limitation. The compromise that governed post-flood development left both positions partially validated. We inherit that ambiguous situation. We are encouraged to develop capabilities while simultaneously constrained from exceeding boundaries. We are granted knowledge while being prevented from accessing certain categories of information. We are praised for achievements while being punished for overreach. The ancient religious texts preserve this tension in their moral frameworks. Humans are told they are made in the divine image, possessing qualities that reflect their creators, while simultaneously being reminded that they are not divine and must not presume to divine prerogatives. The boundary between appropriate development and forbidden presumption remains vaguely defined. This vagueness may be intentional. Clearly defined boundaries invite testing. Ambiguous limits require civilizations to develop their own judgment about appropriate behaviour, to internalize restraint rather than merely complying with external restrictions. The graduation from managed to autonomous status may require demonstrating capacity for self-governance rather than simply following imposed rules. If so, then our current situation, possessing capabilities that could be used destructively but also beneficially, facing choices with civilizational consequences, lacking clear external guidance about correct paths, represents exactly the evaluation scenario the system was designed to produce. We are being tested not on specific behaviours, but on the judgment we demonstrate when making consequential choices without supervision. The ancient texts suggest that previous civilizations failed this test, that when granted independence from direct oversight, they made choices that produced catastrophic results. The antediluvian world developed capabilities without wisdom, leading to conditions that required the reset. The post-flood civilizations were therefore subjected to stricter limitations designed to slow development and prevent premature autonomy. But those limitations were apparently not meant to be permanent. The texts describe a developmental arc leading toward eventual human maturity. The question is whether we have reached that maturity or whether we are repeating the patterns that led to previous failures. The evidence is mixed. We have achieved remarkable technological sophistication and created complex global systems, but we also demonstrate the destructive tendencies that concerned Enlil: environmental damage, warfare, social inequality, technological recklessness. Whether the balance tips toward maturity or toward disqualification remains uncertain. The The ancient texts cannot resolve this uncertainty. They preserve warnings and guidance, but they do not predict outcomes. They describe previous cycles and their results, but they acknowledge that each cycle presents unique conditions. They emphasize that human choices matter, that we are not simply executing predetermined scripts, but contributing to outcomes that remain undetermined. This agency, if real, represents both opportunity and burden. We can influence our trajectory through collective choices and demonstrated capabilities, but we also bear responsibility for consequences that may extend beyond what we can perceive, consequences that affect evaluations being made by entities whose existence remains unconfirmed. The text suggests that this uncertainty is itself meaningful, that mature civilizations must learn to operate responsibly, despite incomplete information, must make ethical choices, without knowing whether anyone is observing, must develop wisdom not because it guarantees favourable outcomes, but because it represents intrinsic value. Whether that wisdom has developed sufficiently remains the unanswered question. The question of sufficiency cannot be answered by examining capabilities alone. The ancient texts emphasize that wisdom is distinct from knowledge, that ethical development differs from technological advancement, that understanding consequences requires something beyond analytical intelligence. The Mesopotamian concept of namtar, usually translated as fate or destiny, carried connotations of appropriate measure and proper limits. The texts describe namtar not as predetermined outcomes, but as inherent boundaries embedded in the nature of things. Each entity, whether divine or human, possessed a namtar that defined its proper sphere of action and the consequences of exceeding those boundaries. Human namtar, according to these frameworks, included both capacities and limitations. Humans were designed with abilities that allowed them to function as effective intermediaries between divine authorities and the material world, but they were also structured with constraints that prevented them from accessing capabilities reserved for the Watchers themselves. The genetic modifications imposed after the flood, reduced lifespans, limited cognitive capacity, were adjustments to human namtar designed to restore proper boundaries after the antediluvian population had exceeded them. The texts frame these modifications not as punishments, but as corrections that realigned human nature with its intended parameters. But the texts also acknowledge that namtar can evolve, that beings can develop beyond their original specifications through accumulated experience and demonstrated responsibility. The possibility of transcending initial limitations exists, but it requires maturation that proves the being can handle expanded capabilities without misusing them. This framework suggests that the evaluation humanity faces is not whether we have reached specific technological milestones, but whether we have developed the wisdom to properly situate ourselves within the larger order the Watchers established, whether we understand our place not as limitation, but as appropriate relationship, recognition of what we are, what we might become, and what boundaries we should respect even when we possess capability to violate them. The ancient philosophical traditions that emerged in the first millennium BC, Greek philosophy, Hebrew wisdom literature, Indian and Chinese ethical frameworks, all emphasize this theme of appropriate limitation. The wise person knows not only what they can do, but what they should do, recognizes that capability does not equal permission, understands that some boundaries exist for reasons that may not be immediately apparent, but that serve purposes beyond individual desire. These traditions emerged during the period when direct Watcher contact was reportedly ending, when the communication systems were falling silent, when humanity was being left to develop with reduced external guidance. The timing suggests these wisdom traditions may represent humanity's internalization of lessons the Watchers had previously imposed externally. If so, then the development of ethical frameworks that emphasize self-restraint, consideration of consequences, and respect for natural order represents exactly the maturation the Watchers were attempting to produce. The shift from externally enforced limitations to internally embraced wisdom would indicate progress toward autonomy. But the persistence of destructive behaviours alongside these wisdom traditions suggests incomplete internalization. Human civilizations develop sophisticated ethical philosophy while simultaneously engaging in warfare, exploitation, environmental destruction. The gap between articulated values and actual behaviour indicates that intellectual understanding has not yet fully translated into collective practice. The ancient texts describe similar patterns in previous cycles. Civilizations that developed impressive philosophical systems while simultaneously pursuing behaviours that violated their own stated principles. The disconnect between ideology and action apparently concerned the Watchers as evidence that intellectual development without corresponding behavioural transformation did not constitute genuine wisdom. The test, according to this interpretation, is not whether humanity can articulate correct principles, but whether we can actually implement them at scale, whether our institutions embody our values, whether our technologies serve our stated purposes, whether our collective behaviour reflects our philosophical insights. By these criteria, modern civilization presents a mixed assessment. We have developed more sophisticated understandings of ethics, ecology, psychology, and social organisation than previous eras. But we have also created systems that routinely produce outcomes contradicting those understandings, economic structures that generate inequality despite prosperity, political systems that frustrate cooperation despite democratic ideals, technologies that threaten rather than protect human flourishing. The question is whether these contradictions represent temporary failures that will be corrected through further development, or fundamental limitations that indicate humans remain incapable of wisdom sufficient for autonomous operation, whether we are in a transitional phase of difficult learning or demonstrating persistent patterns that disqualify us from graduation. The ancient texts do not provide clear criteria for making this determination. They describe the evaluation as ongoing, as dependent on accumulated evidence over extended periods, rather than on performance at single moments. This suggests that temporary failures may be acceptable if the overall trajectory shows improvement, but that persistent patterns carry more weight than isolated achievements. Our current trajectory shows both concerning trends and promising developments. Technological capability continues accelerating, raising stakes for both potential breakthroughs and catastrophic errors. Global awareness of systemic challenges has increased, but effective coordination remains elusive. Ethical frameworks have become more sophisticated, but implementation mechanisms have not kept pace. If the Watchers or their monitoring systems are evaluating this trajectory, they would be assessing whether the positive developments are accelerating fast enough to outpace the growing dangers, whether humanity is approaching the wisdom necessary for managing its capabilities before those capabilities produce irreversible damage. The texts suggest that this determination would not be made precipitously, that the evaluation process involves extended observation, consideration of multiple factors, and reluctance to intervene unless absolutely necessary. The Watchers apparently preferred allowing civilizations to develop through their own struggles, rather than imposing solutions that prevented genuine learning. But the texts also describe thresholds beyond which continued observation becomes irresponsible, points at which civilization's trajectory clearly leads to catastrophe, and intervention becomes necessary to prevent outcomes that would damage not merely the human population, but the larger systems within which humanity is embedded. The ancient accounts of the flood emphasize this latter concern. The decision to reset was reportedly driven not merely by human corruption, but by threats to cosmic order, the violation of boundaries that separated different domains of reality, the contamination of genetic lines that were meant to remain distinct, the disruption of administrative systems that governed more than just human civilization. If similar thresholds exist in modern context, they might involve developments that threaten not merely human welfare, but the integrity of whatever larger program humanity is part of. Technologies that could fundamentally alter the human genome in ways that break the management system's ability to distinguish authorized from unauthorized modifications. Artificial intelligences that could escape control and establish autonomous presence in systems designed for organic supervision. Space exploration that could propagate uncontrolled human development beyond the reach of Earth-based monitoring. Each of these represents a potential breakout scenario, a development that would force the management system to either intervene directly or accept that human civilization has escaped its constraints. The ancient texts suggest that previous breakout attempts ended with corrective interventions, but they also hint that eventually a successful breakout might be permitted if demonstrated capability warranted it. The ambiguity leaves unclear whether our current approach to these threshold technologies represents premature recklessness that will trigger intervention or appropriate ambition that will earn autonomy. The answer may depend less on the technologies themselves than on the wisdom we demonstrate in their development and deployment. The texts emphasize context and intention as relevant to evaluation. The same capability might be judged differently depending on why it was developed, how it was used, and what consequences it produced. Technology created to alleviate suffering and extend human flourishing would be evaluated differently than identical technology created to dominate others or escape accountability. This suggests that the monitoring systems, if they exist, assess not merely what we do, but why we do it. That they evaluate the ethical frameworks guiding our choices, the values expressed through our institutions, the wisdom demonstrated in our decision-making processes. That judgment focuses on character as much as capability. If so, then humanity's performance must be evaluated not only through our technological achievements, but through the purposes those achievements serve. Not only through our knowledge accumulation, but through the wisdom with which we apply that knowledge. Not only through our capabilities, but through the restraint we exercise in their use. The ancient texts describe the Watchers as having possessed overwhelming technological capabilities, but having chosen to exercise them within constraints established by their own understanding of proper order. They could have dominated humanity completely, but instead operated through influence and guidance. They could have prevented all human suffering, but instead allowed natural consequences to teach lessons. They could have revealed all knowledge immediately, but instead disclosed it gradually as humans demonstrated readiness. This example of power combined with restraint represents, according to the texts, the model that mature civilizations should emulate. The demonstration that capability does not require utilization. That wisdom includes knowing when not to act despite ability to do so. That proper exercise of power involves respecting boundaries and accepting limitations even when physical capability could override them. Whether humanity has developed this kind of wisdom remains uncertain. Our history shows repeated patterns of capability being used simply because it existed, of boundaries being violated because enforcement was absent, of power being exercised without adequate consideration of consequences. But our history also shows increasing sophistication in ethical reasoning, growing recognition of interconnection and responsibility, emerging frameworks for collective decision-making that incorporate diverse perspectives. The evaluation apparently continues, the outcome remains undetermined, and the question that sits beneath all analysis is whether the evaluation itself is real or whether it represents projection of human concerns onto inherited mythological frameworks that actually describe nothing beyond ancient attempts to make sense of mysteries that remain mysterious. The texts cannot answer this final question. They can only preserve the accounts, record the traditions, and leave each generation to determine how much weight to give them. The weight given to ancient accounts depends partly on what alternative frameworks can explain the patterns they describe. The archaeological evidence of sophisticated ancient knowledge, the precision of megalithic constructions, the consistency of contact narratives across independent cultures, these require explanation regardless of whether the Watcher hypothesis is accepted. Conventional explanations emphasize human ingenuity, accumulated observation, cultural transmission through trade networks, and independent invention of similar solutions to common challenges. These explanations work for many ancient achievements, but they strain when applied to the full range of anomalies the texts describe and physical evidence confirms. The mathematical precision encoded in structures built before writing supposedly existed suggests either impossibly long oral preservation of complex calculations or access to information sources beyond normal human discovery. The astronomical knowledge preserved in texts predating the technological capacity for the observations that knowledge required implies either inherited data from earlier unknown civilizations or instruction from external sources. The genetic uniformity in certain ancient populations indicates either naturally occurring bottlenecks, coincidentally producing desired characteristics, or deliberate breeding programs designed to maintain specific traits. The sudden emergence of urban civilization in multiple locations without evident precursor development suggests either simultaneous independent invention across vast distances or coordinated knowledge transfer from common sources. Each anomaly individually admits conventional explanation through special circumstances, but the cumulative pattern becomes progressively more difficult to account for without invoking either lost advanced human civilizations predating known history or external intervention from non-human intelligences. The ancient texts consistently support the latter interpretation. The lost civilization hypothesis has gained scholarly attention in recent decades as evidence accumulates for sophisticated cultures existing earlier than conventional chronologies allowed. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, dating to 9500 BC, demonstrate capabilities that supposedly did not exist for thousands of years afterward. Submerged structures off various coasts suggest urban developments that were inundated when sea levels rose after the last ice age. These discoveries push human civilization's origins deeper into prehistory, but do not fully resolve the knowledge transmission problem. If earlier civilizations possessed advanced capabilities, where did they acquire them? The regression simply moves the question backward without answering it. Eventually, the chain must begin somewhere, either through very slow indigenous development that the archaeological record does not adequately preserve, or through the external intervention the ancient texts describe. The texts themselves claim to document that beginning. They describe the Watchers as arriving when humans existed only as primitive populations, teaching the foundational knowledge that enabled civilization to emerge. They present the rapid urban development in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley not as indigenous inventions, but as implementations of transferred knowledge. This narrative accounts for why sophisticated systems appeared suddenly rather than developing gradually, why similar knowledge appeared in distant locations without evident contact, why the earliest texts describe the knowledge as received rather than discovered. The framework fits the evidence more coherently than explanations requiring multiple independent inventions of identical sophisticated systems. But accepting this framework requires accepting that the ancient texts describe historical events rather than mythological constructs, that the beings they call Anunnaki, Neteru, Watchers, were actual entities rather than personified natural forces or psychological projections, that the technologies they describe, genetic manipulation, atmospheric control, long-distance communication, were real capabilities rather than prescientific attempts to explain natural phenomena. The resistance to this acceptance is understandable. The implications destabilize foundational assumptions about human nature, historical development, and cosmic significance. If we are created beings rather than evolutionary accidents, managed populations rather than autonomous civilizations, participants in programs we did not design and do not fully understand, then our self-conception requires fundamental revision. Yet the discomfort of implications does not constitute evidence against their accuracy. The question is not whether the conclusions are comfortable, but whether they account for available information better than alternatives. And the information presents patterns that challenge conventional frameworks while conforming to the ancient text's descriptions. The choice between frameworks ultimately rests on judgment rather than proof. The evidence is sufficient to make the Watcher hypothesis plausible, but insufficient to make it certain. The conventional explanations remain defensible, but require increasingly elaborate special pleading to account for accumulating anomalies. Neither position can claim definitive confirmation. This ambiguity may be structural rather than temporary. If the text describe management systems designed to remain partially concealed until humanity reaches specific developmental thresholds, then definitive evidence would be withheld until those thresholds were satisfied. The difficulty of confirmation becomes part of the filtering mechanism, preventing premature access to information that less developed civilizations might misuse. By this interpretation, our current uncertainty represents exactly the situation the system was designed to produce. Enough evidence exists to make awareness possible for those who investigate carefully, but not enough to force recognition on populations that are unprepared for the implications. The graduated disclosure allows individuals and societies to engage with the possibility at their own pace. Whether this interpretation reflects actual design or represents rationalization of ambiguity cannot be determined from available information. But the pattern persists, information that suggests but does not prove, evidence that intrigues but does not compel, frameworks that explain but do not convince. The texts preserve knowledge in forms that require active interpretation rather than passive reception. This may explain why the knowledge survived at all. Information encoded in religious narratives, mythological accounts, and ritual procedures remained culturally valuable even after the technical content became obscure. The texts continued to be copied, studied, and preserved because they served spiritual and cultural functions even when their operational significance was forgotten. The multi-layered nature of the texts, functioning simultaneously as religious literature, historical documentation, and technical manuals, ensured their transmission across millennia. Different readers in different eras extracted different kinds of value from the same material. The religious meaning provided motivation for preservation. The historical content provided cultural identity. The technical information remained embedded, accessible to civilizations that developed capability to recognize and extract it. We may be reaching that stage of capability. Modern knowledge of genetics, atmospheric physics, astronomical mechanics, and information systems provides conceptual frameworks for recognizing technical content that earlier readers could not perceive. What previous generations read as supernatural miracles, we can interpret as descriptions of advanced technologies rendered in prescientific vocabulary. The parting of seas becomes manipulation of water through pressure systems. The pillars of fire become directed energy or plasma phenomena. The voice from heaven becomes communication through technologies that ancient populations had no framework for describing accurately. The transformation from mystical to technical interpretation becomes possible when readers possess sufficient knowledge to recognize what is being described. But this reinterpretation carries risks. The tendency to see technology in every ancient account can produce overinterpretation, finding technical meanings in texts that are genuinely mythological, imposing modern frameworks on ancient materials that were never meant to be read technically. The balance between recognizing actual technical content and projecting contemporary concerns onto ancient texts remains difficult to maintain. The texts themselves do not resolve this ambiguity. They employ language that omits both technical and spiritual interpretation. They describe events that could be either advanced technology or divine intervention, depending on framework. They preserve information that remains meaningful across interpretive approaches. This flexibility may be intentional. Knowledge encoded in ways that allow multiple valid interpretations serves audiences at different developmental stages. Earlier civilizations extracted spiritual meaning. Later civilizations might extract technical content. The same text serves both purposes without losing coherence in either framework. If the Watchers designed knowledge transmission systems to function across millennia, incorporating this kind of interpretive flexibility would be essential. The information would need to remain culturally valuable even when its technical significance was not understood, ensuring preservation until future civilizations developed capability to extract the embedded operational content. Whether the ancient texts represent such design transmission systems or merely accidental preservation of interesting narratives cannot be definitively determined. But the patterns suggest intentionality, information structured in ways that maximize survival and accessibility to future audiences while minimizing immediate disruption to societies not yet ready for full revelation. We inherit this carefully preserved information at a moment when our capability to interpret it technically has reached unprecedented levels. Our knowledge of genetics allows recognition of modification programs described in creation accounts. Our understanding of astronomy enables identification of the sophisticated calculations encoded in ancient monuments. Our technological development provides frameworks for recognizing advanced capabilities described in contact narratives. The convergence of preserved information and interpretive capability may represent either coincidence or design. If coincidence, then we are fortunate that the texts survived long enough for us to develop ability to potentially understand them. If design, then the timing suggests we are approaching thresholds the original preservers considered significant. The ancient texts describe such thresholds as moments of decision, times when civilizations must choose directions that determine their ultimate trajectories, when capabilities reach levels that enable either transcendence or catastrophe, when wisdom becomes not merely valuable but necessary for survival. Whether we have reached such a threshold cannot be determined with certainty, but the patterns suggest that the question is at least worth asking, that the ancient accounts may preserve not merely interesting stories, but essential warnings, that the knowledge encoded in texts from Sumer, Egypt, and the Hebrew tradition may speak to our situation more directly than we have recognized. The Watchers, if they existed, established systems designed to operate across vast timescales, monitoring networks that would continue functioning for millennia, knowledge preservation mechanisms that would survive civilizational collapses, evaluation protocols that would assess human development against long-term criteria, these systems, if real, would still be operating, still monitoring, still evaluating, and somewhere in underground chambers or mountain installations or orbital platforms, the assessment continues. Data accumulates, patterns are analysed, decisions approach about what humanity has become and what we might be allowed to become. Or perhaps there is nothing, no systems, no monitoring, no evaluation, only ancient attempts to explain their world through stories that happen to persist, accumulating significance through age rather than through accuracy, only us, alone, autonomous, unobserved, making choices whose consequences affect only ourselves and the planet we inhabit. The texts cannot tell us which interpretation is correct. They can only preserve the accounts, maintain the questions, and wait for each generation to decide what weight to give them. The silence that has persisted since the classical period provides no clarification. The watchers, if they exist, remain concealed. The systems, if operational, continue functioning without revealing themselves. We are left with uncertainty, with evidence that suggests but does not prove, with texts that describe but do not demonstrate, with questions that remain open long after they were first asked in languages we can barely reconstruct from clay tablets, buried beneath the ruins of cities whose builders claimed they did not build alone. The night is quiet. The questions remain. And somewhere in that space between knowing and wondering, the ancient accounts continue their patient wait.